So, as we've all been knowing this year, there's been a huge decision we've had to make within 2020, the presidential election. A lot of people have brought up a lot of issues throughout the year about voting fraud, about ballots not counting, and refusing the numbers and not giving up the seat to the president of the United States. But every single election cycle, we oftentimes don't talk about the biggest problem, voter suppression. Voter suppression refers to a systematic method where people target certain communities and either prevent completely or make it much harder to actually place a ballot and make change within their own government. Now, people have been using a lot of ways to try to get around people voting. And within today's society, we can see about three big methods on how government has been preventing certain minority communities to vote. Have you guys heard anything about them?
Yeah, so there have been a lot of studies done in research of this, and a lot of it's been found out that Black Americans and voters of color are less likely than white people to have their requirement to meet the requirements to be able to vote, such as most predominantly like having IDs, like driver's licenses or state IDs. And part of that is because in order to get an ID, it requires a certain fee, and it requires a person to have their birth certificate and be able to get to a place that they can register for an ID, which not everybody is always able to do very easily. And this disproportionately affects minorities in comparison to whites. There was a study done in 2017 that showed there was a very large gap between like white voters and Black and Latino voters in states that had stricter voter ID laws, because in places with those strict laws, there's a lot more steps that a voter needs to take to be able to meet the requirements. And the people who often did not meet those requirements were racial minorities, and also people who tended to be less educated or like have less formal education. There's one example in Georgia in the 2018 gubernatorial election where an individual's voting status would be suspended if the name on their driver's license or social security did not exactly match the name they inputted on their voter registration form. And this affected 51,000 individuals in Georgia who voted in the race for governor, and 80% of those were African Americans, which 51,000 is obviously a big number, but the race for the governor was actually determined by 55,000 votes. So obviously that is very, very significant. 9% of Black respondents and 9% of Hispanic respondents in a study about the last election reported that they were told they didn't have the proper identification to vote, when only 3% of white people who participated in the study said they didn't have the proper identification to vote. Obviously, that's quite disproportional. That is a very large percentage difference. And there has been a lot of evidence to show that these voter ID laws do have disproportionate effects on minority communities.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Abby. Like, I do think that it definitely affects minorities in a negative way, and it impacts them. And it's like just another form of voter suppression, like what we've been talking about, and how it makes their voice like not heard because of these voting ID laws. And these are meant to like target them. So like, I definitely do think that it's like an issue that needs to be addressed. And yeah.
Wait, but I heard that voter ID laws were to prevent people from voting twice, and like voter fraud was a big thing, so that's why voter ID laws were made. Is that not true?
Yeah, voter fraud was actually a big topic in the last election, or that was going around a lot. And that is one of the supposed reasons why these voter ID laws are so helpful and prevent a lot of fraud. But there's actually not a lot of evidence for fraud. And there is a lot of evidence for minorities being affected by these laws. So it really just goes to show that these laws are more like detrimental to like our democracy and our government than they are helpful.
Wow, I never knew. Do you guys know any other methods voter suppression happens?
So one form of like voter suppression that I researched was felony disenfranchisement. And basically felony disenfranchisement is when a person who has been convicted of a crime has their right to vote taken away because of this conviction. Oftentimes this is permanent, but sometimes a person's right to vote can be given back to them once they have served their time. And these laws are different depending on the state that a person lives in. And like in one article that I found, it detailed over 6 million Americans were not able to vote because of the disenfranchisement laws, and a disproportionate amount of people affected by these laws are people of color. So the article detailed how Black people are more likely to lose their right to vote compared to the average like adult population. And from some surveys that were done, 8 in 10 people think that people who have finished their sentence should be given their right to vote back. And also 2/3 of the people think that people on parole or even on probation should be allowed to vote as well. So what do you guys think about this?
I don't know. If these guys committed crimes, should we really trust them to vote? Do they deserve the right to vote?
I think that's an interesting point you brought up because there have been actual studies done that show that African Americans and again, racial minorities are more likely to be convicted as felons in comparison to whites who committed the same crime. So when you take this into consideration, I think it goes to show that like it's almost implying that minorities are more likely to vote for things that are immoral or that we shouldn't trust their judgment because they are convicted felons, when in reality it's just preventing more people from minority groups, preventing them from voting. So
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that one too. And people can change too, like depending on the severity of the crime. Like people shouldn't be held accountable for like, or shouldn't be like judged for past actions that could have happened when they were younger or something that was like small. So like, and we know like there's like a lot of police that target Black people and convict them for crimes that are like not that big, but they get like a bigger sentence. That's not like really justified. So like, I definitely think that it should be considered that this is not like the best like method, you know. But yeah.
You guys bring up definitely some good points, but I really think though that my next problem is the biggest problem with voter suppression. What I was focusing on was something called gerrymandering. Now, whenever we talk about the election, gerrymandering is by far one of the most overused terms, but not a lot of people really understand what gerrymandering is even for. Back in 1812, the lawmakers thought there would be a smart rule for the incumbent to be able to draw the district lines of the county or the district or even the country or the city that they're running against. What this creates is certain groups are pushed to the left or pushed to the right of their county, all to fit into these drawn borders. But the real issue that we're looking at with gerrymandering is by grouping minorities together, it often makes it easier for the government and the system to target these communities, preventing them a lack of rights to voting materials or translated materials, and also making it harder for people in these communities to find voting centers and actually give their ballot into the mail-in or the drop-in ballots. Gerrymandering has a lot of flaws in its issues. Have you guys ever heard about it?
Yeah, so basically like the one thing of gerrymandering that I found was that like a lot of times it's used to like it disenfranchise like minority communities and basically makes it harder for them to be represented due to the way that the districts are being drawn. So like I definitely think that it's a pretty big issue with voting and like it prevents people's voices from being heard.
it's interesting because the original intention of gerrymandering, you brought up like the law was created back in 1812, was originally to give minorities a voice, not prevent them from having a voice, which is how I kind of understood it. So is that not what happens today?
Well, I'm glad that you brought it up because that essentially is the reason why gerrymandering was created. It wanted to create a system where if there was 20% minority in 5 different counties, that you could redraw the district lines to provide 4 counties to the majority and group all the 20% of the Democrats from 5 into one and give them one state. But now what happens is people who are the incumbent or people who have already won or sitting in the office, they have the ability and the luxury to redraw the maps the way they want and how the districts are supposed to be counted. So what often happens in today's time is that whoever's sitting in office, whether red or blue, will draw the lines in order to ensure that whatever party they support will be the majority and give them the most amount of votes in order to keep their seat. And what this looks like to people who are voting is if you live in Playa Vista, but your county is all the way in North Hollywood, it wouldn't really make much sense. But that's oftentimes what happens when we're redrawing these lines is people who are minorities are often pushed into different districts that aren't decided by where they live or where they attend school or where their family's at, just based on how many votes does that county provide. And what we've seen in the past 100 years is that everyone who's sitting in office tends to draw the maps that only really benefit their party. What we should be asking is, why aren't the maps being drawn according to where I live and how the people around me vote, rather than this one person who's sitting in our office deciding on where people get to vote and where their votes count cannot be a legitimate system to elect our representative officials. I think that gerrymandering has maybe had the right intent in the beginning, but it's really gotten lost just because of the amount of independency you have to draw the maps. So, Abby, you're right, but I just think that it's been convoluted. I think throughout the past 100 years, 200 years, that we really lost the meaning of why gerrymandering was created and kind of just using it for our personal benefits.
How does this connect to the course? Well, the topic that we've discussed details voter suppression and how this negatively impacts minorities. And the US has been known for implementing tactics that impact votes against minorities, such as like what we've been talking about so far. And like our course, like Growing Up American, focuses on the notion of the American dream. And that's like something that's really prevalent to like having our civil liberties, and that's a part of the American dream. And like in one of our readings, Malcolm X's autobiography, it called into question whether this American dream is really applicable to people of all backgrounds and demographics, or if it's just a select amount of people. So this course further engages in the discussion on how race and identity play a role into the way that people are treated and how it affects their civil liberties. So like I mentioned earlier, like the idea of the American dream includes having like civil liberties. So when these liberties are like taken away from us, we have demonstrated, as we have like demonstrated earlier through like voter suppression, it proves that the American dream isn't for everybody and it's only for like a select amount of people. And like voting is supposed to be a place for each person's voice to be heard, no matter like your level of income, status, or race. And each person should have an equal chance to vote about what they care about. However, the government has put in place like many regulations in order to sway those votes. And through things such as gerrymandering and voter ID laws and felony disenfranchisement, this has caused the voices of many people, many minorities, and people of lower income status to be suppressed. And this infringes on their civil liberties, which it also like connects to like our course, which is what our course is all about the American dream and civil liberties.
I agree with you, Lucci, and it's interesting because the ways in which the United States has treated minorities throughout its history has obviously changed and developed, but it hasn't necessarily meant that they're treated equally by any means. Obviously, in the reading with Malcolm X, a lot of what he was fighting against was racial discrimination, but that is not something that exists so outrightly anymore, but minorities still are very disadvantaged in this country, especially even like through government and the ways in which our country operates.